Hey everybody, it's Matt from Eastwood Company and welcome to another live technical broadcast where we're teaching you about using Eastwood products and everything that's new at Eastwood. If you haven't watched one of these videos before, we want this to be as interactive as possible. So we want you to like, share, and first and foremost, we want you to comment and ask questions. So if you have any type of questions, today we're covering filler rod feeding with TIG welding. So if you have anything TIG welding related, feel free to ask a question. We have Randy over here that you see in some of the live broadcasts and other videos. He's on the computer answering questions, and if we have any live questions, he's going to feed them over to me, and I'm going to do my best to answer them for you guys. So again, like, share, comment, and we're going to try and make this a cool little quick tech tip. So today I'm talking about filler rod and feeding the filler rod. Oftentimes when we work with customers here at our retail stores and we do TIG classes, something that TIG welder, beginner TIG welders often struggle with is feeding the filler rod. Biggest problem that I see is they use it as a crutch and you hold your filler rod way out like this. So our torch is out here at this end, and beginners tend to hold the rod way at the end there. Causes a lot of problems. So I wanted to show you guys a good technique for holding the filler rod and give you a couple of tips and tricks along the way. So TIG welding filler rod comes in these little tubes here that I have on the table. You need to have filler rod that as close as possible matches what you're welding. So if you're welding just a carbon steel, the most common one that we offer, that is a common one that you'll find in your welding supply store as well, is a ER70S-2. So with the little -2 on the end, there's different numbers on the end there, and they have different types of additives that are put into the filler rod, for lack of a better term, that are put into the filler rod. They may be for a specific use, whether it's something that's metal that is more dirty or by nature, the makeup of it. But there's a bunch of different uses, but the -2 is probably the most common that you'll find. It works well for welding most any steel that you're going to come across when you're working on automobiles. If you get into using stainless, like for exhaust systems and things of that nature, ER4043 is probably the most common, most universal that you can use. And we're just trying to turn it so you guys can see the tube here. So there's always on the tube, it tells you what it is and the different makeups. Also on the tubes, it's going to be hard for you guys to see on here, but there's a little short description. So if you're ever at a welding supply store and you're not sure what the numbers mean, you can read right on the tube. It'll kind of give you an idea of what it's best used for. But 4043 is pretty good all around for welding stainless. You can also get by with using 4043 and some of the other stainless filler rods if you have to weld cast iron. So if you're welding, repairing like a cast iron piece, like a manifold or something like that, you can get away with using a stainless rod, preheating the part, using a stainless rod, and then letting the part cool very slowly. So you can get by with using that. That's one of the little kind of tricky ones that you wouldn't think. If you use just a standard steel rod, the ER70S, you may find it's going to tend to crack on you. So using the stainless is helpful. Oh, crap. I'm sorry. The first one I was holding up was aluminum. So jump back. ER308. Sorry, 4043 is the aluminum. I picked up the wrong rod. I got a head cold and I am not on the top of my game. So 4043 is the most common aluminum rod that you're going to use, an alloy filler rod. So this is the type of filler rod you're going to use for any type of automotive. Again, if you're doing some sort of intake or something like that, or you're doing aluminum repairs, wheels, things like that, you can use the 4043. You may need to step it up if you're using if you're doing a cast aluminum part, you may have to switch it up. So this is the aluminum rod. I'm sorry, I misspoke on that. Don't want to confuse anybody. And this is only for using aluminum. The 308, not to be confusing, 308 is the common, ER308 is common stainless. And this is the one I was talking about, that you can interchange it and use it with some cast iron repairs. You can use the 308. There's a bunch of different filler rods that are out there, but these are the most common ones that we offer and that you're going to find in your local welding supply store. If you're ever unsure, if you lose these tubes, they're a good way to hold them. But if you're ever unsure what filler rod you have, you got a little stack of filler rod, you're not going to be able to see it on camera here, but there's a little flat spot on the rod and really fine. Let's see how good Joe, the camera guy's zoom skills are today. If you look real close, there's some actual raised writing on there, and they will say the type of rod. It will say, like for instance, this would have the ER70 on, actually this side, will have the ER70S. So if you have a bunch of rod that you're unsure about, that's fresh rod, that you haven't melted the edge off, you can look at the rod real close and you can kind of see, but I tend to keep them in the tube as much as possible because it keeps them from corroding, from sitting out in the open, as well as it keeps it organized. So that's just a basic intro to the filler rod. Also, another little misconception I wanted to clear up is the filler rod. Most commonly, I hear this with the mild, with the steel filler rod. This is basically the same thing. It's what's coming out of your MIG spool. So if you ever look at your MIG spool that's in your MIG welder, if you look real close, it's probably going to have that ER70 right on it. It's basically the same exact material. There's no magic. It's just that this is straight and cut to length versus in a spool. So if you're ever in a pinch and you're doing sheet metal or something that's thin gauge and you don't have like 035 or similar filler rod that's in the straight lengths, what you can do is you can run some off your spool, off your MIG gun, and you can straighten it out and then use that for TIG welding thin gauge steel. So there's no difference in it. It's going to weld the same. Only thing I tend to do is I'll hit it with a Scotch-Brite after I straighten it out just to make sure. But it's the same thing. So actually the holding the filler rod, we'll get into that. I'm going to turn the machine on, so I'm going to probably sit down here and show you guys. And then we're going to do a couple little welds. I'm going to show you with the feeding the filler rod. We'll get a couple shots under the hood, as we would say. So Joe is going to end up putting a lens on our camera once we get to that point where you can actually see the weld. And I'm going to try and show you how to feed the filler rod in and how to lay it into your puddle. So how to feed the filler rod or how to hold it. We're not welding now, so I'm going to do this without gloves so you guys can see. So what I like to do, this is my personal preference, is I like to lay the filler rod across my middle finger there like that to balance. And I'll turn my hand here so you guys can see with the camera. And I put my thumb, I pinch a little bit with my index finger, and then with my thumb in the back, I kind of hold it towards the back. So as I feed, I move my two index and middle finger, and then I pinch again with my thumb. So I grab and I feed like that. And I'm just really using the thumb kind of as a guide. I'm not really putting that much pressure on it. I help push a little bit sometimes, but this is something you really, really need to practice if you're trying to learn how to TIG weld, because you're going to run into instances, aside from the technique being poor and it's going to hurt your weld, you're going to run into instances where you're going to need to add a lot of filler rod fast. Say you're filling up a void, or you're welding something, you're trying to get in and get out, be real hot, and you may need to add filler rod quick. So you need to practice so you can feed quickly and continuously like that. So what I suggest is, and I joke around when we do classes, is to just sit at home while you're watching TV, grab a little piece of filler rod and just sit there and roll it in your fingers and move it. Just doing this over and over again, you'll eventually get used to the motion of feeding the filler rod. It'll get more comfortable. It'll be second nature, so when you go to weld, you're not trying to learn a bunch of things at one time. So I've also seen where people will put it more between the first two fingers and pinch and move like that. Nothing wrong with that. I like holding it out towards the edge, almost like I'm holding the pencil. So kind of the same thing, I'm just angling my hand differently. I like to hold it more like that, but you can hold it, kind of do a lobster claw type deal and grab. It just gets difficult if you practice like this. If you start doing thinner gauge stuff where you're using that 035, real thin, almost like MIG wire, that's what's going to get difficult if you're doing the lobster claw style. It's hard to hold the rod. I like using the tips of my fingers to hold it so it's a little more fine. So, Joe, if you want to come around, I'll show real quick before we do an actual weld. We'll show you on the workpiece here, and then we're going to lay a couple. Oh yeah, Joe's reminding me, which question comes up on videos sometimes. I am left-handed in most things I do with writing and throwing and things like that. So for me, when I was learning how to weld, I was most comfortable welding, putting the torch in my left hand, my strong hand, and I used the filler rod in my weak hand, in my right hand. So this isn't the gospel. You don't have to do this. I've had people that we've taught how to weld where they're struggling by holding the torch in their strong hand. You get them to switch hands, and suddenly it just clicks and it works. So for me, the reason I like to hold the torch in my left hand, I feel like I have more dexterity in this hand. So when you're welding out of position or you're welding something that's not just a straight piece like we're doing today, I can more easily maneuver my wrist, and I just feel like I have more dexterity in this hand. So that's why I choose to hold the torch in this particular hand. And the filler rod, I just had to teach myself how to feed it. And otherwise, it's not doing too much other than maybe twisting a little bit. But if you're having some trouble learning and it just feels like it isn't clicking by holding the torch in your strong hand, just do a couple runs or try an afternoon of practice where you put the torch in the opposite hand, put your filler rod in your strong hand, and some people, it works better that way. It just depends on the person. It is good to practice both ways because there's going to be instances where you're out of position where you just can't weld with the torch in your strong hand, so you may need to switch around. So I try and every now and then sit down and practice a little bit with my other hand. I don't practice as often as I should, but at least I have the ability to weld that way. So that's a good one that some of the guys told me that people have asked on some of the YouTube videos why we're welding, the filler rod's in that hand versus another. I'm just left-handed, and that's how I hold it. So that's a good one. Randy, do you have any comments or questions while Joe's going to sneak over then?
Yeah, actually, we have one question. Did you go over stainless rod? The question was, do you weld, if you're welding stainless with a TIG, do you use stainless rod? Can you use regular rod as a filler?
Oh, okay. So we had a question as far as going over the stainless a little more in depth. Can you use, basically the short of the question is, do you need to use the stainless rod when you're welding stainless, or can you use another rod? If I'm welding anything that I really care about, you really need to use stainless rod. That's the short answer. The long is, I've gotten away with using the ER70S, just the standard carbon steel rod, and it will weld stainless steel. That doesn't mean that it will be the strength that it needs to be, but you can melt the metal, the two metals together, and you can make a weld. So I've done that on exhaust systems and things like that, where maybe it's something I'm just patching together, or I don't have stainless rod handy. I've used that, or a little bracket or something, but I try and use the stainless as much as possible. If you can't, you can get away with using ER70. Again, it'll melt it together, but the other thing to keep in mind, that weld that you use with the ER70, that weld is filled with a ferrous metal that's going to rust. So you have to remember that. If you're welding an exhaust system and you use the standard steel filler rod, every one of those joints is going to rust and will rust out. So it's not, it's not an end-all thing. So you need to treat those areas. You need to seal them up somehow with an exhaust paint like we offer that will cover those areas and keep them from rusting out. So the answer is yes, you can use other rods, but if at all possible, keep a tube of stainless rod handy, so when you're doing the job, you have the correct filler rod. Good. So that was the only question we had. So we'll keep going. Again, if you have any other questions about TIG welding in general or filler rod, make sure you ask, like, share, all of that good stuff, and we'll keep bringing these to you. So the actual process. So I hold the torch. Again, I'll hold the filler rod because it's easier to see. If this was my torch, I hold my torch kind of like the filler rod, like a pencil. So I hold it the same way. I put the hose over my arm, and then I hold the torch like a pencil. This head here you can rotate, so I have it rotated a little bit for when we're welding in the position we're welding. But if you think of this, take away that section there and just think of this like a pencil, holding it kind of like a pencil, like I would write. That's just most comfortable for me. Holding the torch like this or like this, I'm not saying it's wrong, but that isn't good for when you're doing fine detail work. Now, if you're doing pipe welding or something like that, you will see where guys will hold the torch more like that and they can walk the cup like that. But when you're doing more fine work, like you see with most people in our realm, most of you guys I'm figuring are probably working on, are doing automotive or motorcycle related projects. You're doing more of what I would call fine work. You're not doing a big pipeline where you're walking the cup around a huge piece of pipe. So for that, I like to hold it kind of like a pencil, like I'm saying. I'm going to turn the torch. I'm just going to rotate this head a little bit because we have the piece turned so that Joe can get in here and actually see the weld. Normally I would turn the piece a little differently, but I have it turned here. So I have my torch, about a 45, and then I have my filler rod coming in at maybe like a 10-degree angle. Now, when you hold the filler rod way out, like I'm saying a lot of beginners do, one thing you can just see with me, just from me moving my hand or the little bit of shaking that I might have in my right hand, it's making that filler rod bounce all over the place. And that's not even really my hand shaking, that's just me talking and the little bit of movement that happens. It makes that filler rod bounce around. So you imagine when you're trying to weld, doing a tiny little weld, and this piece here, it's bouncing all over the darn place. How the heck can I? So when you're trying to add, it's going to be bouncing all over the place. So you're trying to hit a moving target. It's the same thing. So I'm bouncing around. You're going to end up touching, dipping the rod in there, into your tungsten, where you're going to miss or it's going to get stuck. So it's not good to do it like that. And I'll show you one under the hood so you can really see. So what I like to do is I like to choke up on it as much as I wouldn't say as much as I can, but I like to choke up to the point where it's not bouncing around anymore. But I also don't want my hand all the way into I don't want it all the way into the hot zone. So I got my torch turned, and I'm going to add this right to the front of the puddle like that. And I'll move, add a little more. And I don't have to feed this rod necessarily right away. I might be able to do a handful of dips, and then once the rod starts to get short to the point where it's coming up the rod and it's messing up my angle, then I'll just do a little feed like that, and then I'll keep working, might do a few dips, and I'll do another little feed. Now, if we were doing something where I was trying to fill a void, where we're walking back and forth, where I'm weaving, where I'm adding a lot of filler, using a lot of filler rod, then I might almost every dip be adding, and feeding as I go. But if you hold the piece all the way, the filler rod all the way back like this, another thing that happens is you'll hold the piece like this, and as you're working, you're going to end up running up. Essentially, you're almost, I'm exaggerating, but you're running your torch up into this filler rod because it's at an angle. So as you're going along the seam here, you're going to end up hitting here because it's up at an angle, and you're trying to angle it in like that, and you're going to end up touching the two of them. So it's good to keep it a little more flat, less of an angle, and just feed the rod as you need it. So you can keep that angle the same. Dip, dip, dip. And I might add a little bit, add a little more, and then feed a little more and dip, dip, dip as we go along. So keep the choke up on the filler rod pretty good. I probably got about, I don't know, 6 or 8 inches there that's sticking out. You can do a little more than that depending on the rod, but try not to go too far back because you're going to lose your accuracy. Another thing that I like to do, a little tip, is these rods come in this long length, so it's even more exaggerated if we're holding this uncut piece here. So the pieces I was showing you first, that's basically one of these cut in half. There's no need for you to let this whole big piece dangle out, or if you're holding at this end, it's dangling out behind you, hitting yourself in the back or whatever. There's no need for that unless you're doing a run that you need to use up all this filler rod or most of it in one run. If you're doing a short little pass or you're stitch welding or something like that, or maybe it's something that you need to stop because you're out of position, there's no harm cutting your filler rod in half and using it like that. No problem at all. It's a little easier. You don't have the weight of your filler rod bouncing off your hand. Again, it's going to affect your accuracy. The only time I do this is if I'm doing something where I'm doing a long run, where I'm filling an area where I really got to use, over half of this filler rod, then I won't cut it. But 90% of the time, first thing I do is I cut this rod in half and have it sitting here to use. And then you can just pick the pieces up as you go. So I also keep my short pieces. Like here's one that we did a little test run to get the camera set up. So I used about half this rod in the pass. So I keep these laying around if I have to do some small little job. I don't throw them away. So I usually get them down till they're tiny, and then I'll throw them away. Just use as much as you can, just as long as you're not burning your hands up. So now we showed you guys that. Joe's going to move around. We'll get set up with the lens, and we'll show you guys a couple under the helmet. And hopefully you guys can see what we're doing. Any other questions that we got?
Yeah, we have a few more questions, but maybe you want to get to them after this.
Oh,
it
okay.
Might take
sure.
a couple minutes.
Sure. Well, thank you guys for asking questions. We're gonna do a couple welds, and hopefully maybe as I do this, it'll help you guys understand, or might even answer your questions. And then we'll hit a couple of them at the end here. So if you guys haven't watched any of the other ones, we did a intro to TIG welding live video, I'd say, I don't know what it was, 3 weeks ago or so, where I went into more of the basics of just doing a weld. I'm kind of skipping over that today. I'm just really showing you guys how to hold the filler rod and focus on feeding the filler rod is what we're narrowing down on today. But if you guys have any questions or you want some more insight on just the beginning of getting set up, how to TIG weld, best practices, check out that video. You can search it up on our YouTube channel. Username is Eastwood Co. And you can see that, that video in its entirety there. So I'm going to get set up here. Joe's got his lens on. So I'm going to show you one with the filler rod choked up here. And let me know when you're ready, Joe. All right, so I'm going to try and exaggerate some of this for you guys so you can really see. So I'm getting my puddle started. I'm going to choke up on it a little more. And I'm going to add a bunch of filler rod. So you can see I'm kind of pulling it out of the puddle. I'm not letting it hang in the puddle. I'm going real slow here so I can show you guys, really exaggerate the process of adding that filler rod in. So you let it kind of suck the filler rod in. And now I'm getting kind of short on my filler rod. So I'm going to feed just a tiny bit there. I just fed a little bit out. So I'm doing 3-4 dips. Now I've fed a little bit. Another couple dips. Fed a little bit. So usually when I pull back, I feed a little bit. Now I'm just doing a quick, I'm feeding every time. So when you pull back, you can do that feed. And off. So you can see I kept the filler rod about the same length each time, or the whole entire weld. The stick out from my hand that's actually into the weld puddle was about the same the whole entire time. Didn't change, and when I saw it getting a little short, then I added just a little bit with my hand and kept moving. So that's kind of the correct way for keeping the filler rod stick out on the short side. Let me do another one here. I'm going to hold a whole piece and let you see what happens. And that's hot. We're just going to weld right on the other side of this piece here. So what I'm going to do is, what I'm showing you guys, I'm going to try and do it with the filler rod sticking out pretty far and see what happens. But if you see yourself like this isn't right. All right, you ready, Joe? Without stabbing you, think we can get a shot? Let me know when you're ready. All right, so we got a puddle started here. I'm trying to fit this in here. Holy crap, this is hard. I'm kind of getting it. It's hard to get it to touch. You know, that's what's happening. It's bouncing off the piece. I'm not getting it right into the keyhole of that weld. And because of that, I got to go really slow. So we're heating our piece up. Another thing is, you'll see guys kind of hold it in the weld joint at an angle and then just run up the piece. But this is what happens. You just hold it there, and it's just pulling little pieces off. It's not really adding it to the weld. You're just letting it sit in there. That's not any good either, letting it hang out. So I got some pliers here. We'll show you the difference in welds. So you can see when you hang the filler rod out real far, I had no accuracy. The filler rod's bouncing around. It's hitting the edge of the piece. It's dipping in the puddle before I'm ready. It's just not what I want. And then when you lay it into the weld seam at an angle like that, you're just pulling little pieces off of the rod, and it's not actually, you're not feeding it into the. So this is our piece we just did there. And jumping around all over the place. Surprisingly, I didn't end up with anything on the top there when I was bouncing around that beginning section. And then this one's got a little bit of undercut just because of how slow I was going. A little bit undercut in it, but that one was with the filler rod choked up. We were going nice and slow so you guys could really see, but you could see that the puddle, you know, the consistency of the dabs into the piece, much more consistent. We have a lot more control. We weren't bouncing around. There's no pinholes or gaps in the weld there. That's a lot better. So you're going to see just visually, and I wasn't exaggerating there in the beginning with the filler rod hanging, that was bouncing around. I was trying pretty hard there to keep a decent weld, and it was really tough. So that just gives you shows you how you should hold the filler rod and feeding the filler rod. Hopefully that helps you guys a little bit. Just keep that in mind when you're welding. Sit at home, practice feeding the filler rod to get yourself comfortable, and hopefully you can get to the point where you can really start feeding the filler rod, and it's just mechanical. You know, it's not something you really think about. So you said you had a couple questions that people had asked? Excuse me.
Yeah, one question was about sheet metal.
Yes.
Which rod and TIG welder settings would you suggest? And also lends into a couple other questions we had about how do you know how to do the settings for your metal. And I believe there's a chart maybe we want to show the people on them.
So the first question, all really good questions we got there that Randy gave us from you guys. First one is questions about sheet metal specifically, what type of rod to use. Pretty much all the time I use ER70S, just a standard rod. Now, the rod that you want to use, the diameter is what is important. Big mistake that I see beginners or people that are just starting to TIG weld sheet metal is they use a rod that is much too thick. So the rod that we're using today here, this one we have out is 3/32, but the rod I was actually welding with was 1/16. This is probably the most common rod that I use for doing, I'd say, medium to heavy fabrication, depending on what I'm doing. When I'm doing sheet metal work, which is what I really like to do, I use an 035 rod, which you can get at a welding supply store, but the downside is that you have to buy it in 10-pound packs. So if you don't see yourself doing that much sheet metal or you don't have the money to buy a huge 10-pound pack at a time in the straight lengths, you can take your MIG welder spools, which is most commonly 030, but you can get the 035, and it's solid core, not the flux core, the solid core. You can roll that spool out, and you can pull out the pieces and make your own straight filler rod. Again, ER70S. You can put that out and use that on sheet metal. And then I guess we had a question about settings for sheet metal as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, the question was, how do you know what settings to use?
Okay.
Is there a chart to get started that gets you in the ballpark?
So the question was, how do we know what settings to use for when we're welding sheet metal or any type of metal, really? I guess that question could lend to. Our particular machine, we try and make life easy for you guys. So we have a chart over here on the top of the machine that will get you in the ballpark. And Joe's going to zoom in on that for you guys. That will get you in the ballpark. It's going to tell you with what tungsten or electrode you're using, the diameter, what filler rod diameter, and then a setting as far as the amperage setting, where it'll get you. If you're on aluminum, it's also going to give you the clearance effect or the AC balance. It's going to give you that setting as well to get you close. So if you're just learning, it's always good to look on the machine. It'll get you pretty close. So you can set the pedal and get yourself in that range. But after you start doing it for a while, you'll kind of know. Like, I know that if I'm doing sheet metal, I usually set my pedal around 50 to 70 amps max. And then I tease the pedal anywhere from 30 to 40 amps, 50 amps in that range when I'm welding sheet metal. It all depends on how quick you go. So the settings on the machine will get you pretty darn close. I always run a test run on a piece of metal that's the same thickness, if possible. Make sure that it's all correct and it's how you like, then start welding on your project. But use that chart if you have our welder, the Eastwood TIG 200. Just use that chart just to get yourself real quick set up, and then run your test piece, and you'll get yourself dialed in really quickly. But once you've done this a few times, I don't even have to look anymore. I could set the pedal and just know. But you got to do a lot of welding to do that. You can also do a formula to figure out the thickness of the metal, to figure out the amperage that it takes to weld. But there's a lot of variables that can change that depending on your skill level.
Yeah, Zach would like to know if TIG welding is stronger than MIG welding.
So Zach asked us if a question, probably one of the most common questions we get, is TIG welding stronger than MIG welding? The overall answer is no. They're pretty much equal if done correctly, is the answer. And each one has its own instance where it is better. So there is times where a MIG welder is far better and stronger because of the application of the job that you're doing, where I'd prefer a MIG welder. TIG welding can be equally as strong, but it may take more passes because of the nature of the type of welding you're doing, where you're actually adding the filler rod yourself. It may take more passes, where a MIG you can fill it up quicker and easier. But if you prepare your weld joint correctly, your settings are right, and your technique is correct, you can TIG weld and MIG weld something, and they're both going to be, fairly the same in strength. But again, there's always an exclusion to that. But for anything you're doing in automotive, MIG or TIG, it's going to be about the same strength, but if prepped correctly and done correctly. But it all comes down to what you're more comfortable with and what the finish is going to be. it may vary that. Now, if I'm doing sheet metal, I prefer to use a TIG welder, most definitely, because TIG welding is a softer weld. You can manipulate the metal just as strong as far as how the metal is welded, but the workability, you can't really work MIG welds as much as you can with a TIG weld. So the answer is they're basically going to be the same, but there is instances. So I like TIG welding because it's a little cleaner. There's less sparks and everything like that, less grinding when done with a TIG welder. But that's a good question.
And Reginald would like to know if TIG welding is the best for body and fenders, sheet metal.
Okay. Reginald would like to know, he asked, if it is best, if TIG welding is best for auto body, sheet metal, fenders, which I kind of in the last one I got into a little bit, but yes, TIG welding is probably, TIG welding and oxyacetylene are the two best types of welding when it comes to sheet metal work. Those are the two best. Oxyacetylene is by far the softest, most workable weld, but it is a little more difficult to do and puts more heat into the panel. I think that TIG welding is the best because you can have a small area that's actually heated up versus using an oxyacetylene torch, and it's also almost just as workable, and you can really melt the metal together, get 100% fusion, and it'll be nice and flat. You can hammer and dolly it, you can bend it, you can run it through an English wheel and form it, the same as the parent metal that you're welding. So yeah, TIG welding I would say is the best, but TIG welding sheet metal takes a lot of practice. You've really got to get your control down and really understand how to get your puddle control down before you just start jumping into welding a quarter panel on a car. So that's a good question as well.
And we've got one more question from YouTube. What are the advantages? Don't forget, we do air this on YouTube too. What are the advantages of TIG welding over torch welding? So I guess they mean gas welding?
Yeah, okay. So we had Randy mentioned a good thing if you guys didn't hear that. We do broadcast this also on YouTube, so we kind of simulcast this on YouTube and Facebook. So if you follow our YouTube channel, you can easily go on there and watch and ask questions. So we had a YouTube viewer that asked, sorry, it was the differences?
Are there advantages of TIG over gas welding?
Okay, so the advantages of of torch welding, which I'm going to assume they mean oxyacetylene welding, versus TIG welding. There is advantages, which I kind of alluded to in the last question, when you're doing sheet metal type work with a torch. There's definitely advantages as far as the workability of the weld after you're done welding. The disadvantages when it comes to sheet metal with using an oxyacetylene torch is it heats up a much larger area. You're going to warp more metal using a torch just because of the nature of it. It's going to heat up more of an area versus a TIG weld. It's going to be a smaller area. It's not going to warp the metal as much if your technique is good. But the great thing about oxyacetylene is it can kind of deal with less than, not the greatest atmosphere, I guess you could say. So if you have a dirty piece of metal, or if you're welding outside or something like that, you can use an oxyacetylene torch, and as long as the wind or the elements isn't too bad, you can weld all the same. It really doesn't matter. Where a TIG welder, even if I have the garage door open in the shop and there's a gust of wind coming through, it'll blow that shielding gas away, contaminate the weld, and we're pretty much out of luck. It's best to just kind of look at what situation you're doing and also what you're best at. I'm not a real strong oxyacetylene welder. I usually use my oxyacetylene more for heating and bending and manipulating metal than welding. So I usually go to the TIG torch just because I like that better. But there's plenty of guys that are really good with the oxyacetylene, and they use that because they're stronger with it. So if you have a circumstance where you're outside or the metal isn't as clean, you can't get it as clean as you can like, you can use a torch and still weld where a TIG welder couldn't do that. So you use the same filler rod, that's all the same, and the technique's pretty darn similar, but you have to understand how to set up your torch. So TIG welding has a learning curve as far as technique goes that's probably steeper, But oxyacetylene, a lot of people don't realize when you're welding with oxyacetylene, the torch setup, so your knobs, your mixture, is what's really important with getting your torch set up just right so that you're getting a nice clean flame, and it's a nice hot flame that you can heat as small area as possible. So you got to have the correct tips and everything as well. So there is some differences, but I think for automotive use, TIG welding is generally the best versus oxyacetylene welding for most instances. I would say it is. Any other?
You want to take one more?
Sure, yeah, I don't mind.
I have a simple one. Why isn't there an auto feed for TIG welding?
So someone asked a good question. I kind of expected this one. Someone asked, why isn't there an auto feed for TIG welding? The answer is there is. I've seen a couple of them online. I don't know if there's actually anything in production that's an auto feed. I would say, I don't know why there isn't. It hasn't been put into production. But the one thing I will say is that when you're feeding the filler rod, it's not a constant feed. So whether you've got a device that you're hitting a button that's telling it to feed it, and it's something holding it for you, or you're just feeding it yourself, you can't just set up an automatic feed that it's feeding like a MIG welder constantly the whole time, because it kind of makes it difficult with TIG welding, because there's times when you need to add a bunch of filler rod, and then you may back off and not add as much. So it's not a constant feed all the time that you're doing, because more than likely you're probably not doing welding on a bench like this with just two flat pieces of steel. You're doing something that's a different shape, or you may need to be more filler rod in the beginning and less at the end. So I don't think it's necessary. Rather than trying to find a tool that does it for you in that instance, I think it's better just to teach yourself how to feed the filler rod. But I have seen some things online that guys have made little devices to feed the filler rod. There's probably something on the market, I'm just not aware of it, to do that. But I think the cost is much better, because I already got this thing right here. Why not just learn how to do it? It's free, rather than buying an item and I still got to learn how to do it. You still got to push a button or turn it on or manipulate it. So that's my answer for that. So that's all our questions. Thanks, guys, for watching. I'm really glad you guys are asking more questions like that. Bring them on anytime we're doing these demos. Ask as many questions as you like, and we'll either answer them through the chat live, or I'm going to try and, myself or whoever's hosting will try and answer them right on camera. If you have any ideas for future live videos that you'd like to see, any of our products in use, or types of techniques that you'd like to see done, whether it's welding, fabrication, paint, auto body, anything, let us know. Drop us a comment on one of these videos. The videos are always up afterwards. We leave the recorded versions up so you can watch them and comment, and we monitor those comments, and we'll do our best to put any of these videos up that we can. And again, as always, make sure you follow us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, all username Eastwood Co. Follow us on there, and you can see more live demos as well as any type of videos and anything going on, everything that's Eastwood, you can find in those places. Thanks, guys, for watching. I'll catch you guys later.